A simple woman working as a janitor at the university noticed a flaw in a professor's complex equation. At first, everyone dismissed her with condescending smiles and whispered ridicule. But everything changed the moment she stepped forward, took the chalk in her hand, and began to write. "The cleaning lady's back again," one student whispered just loud enough for the rows ahead to catch it. Saoirse Hughes smoothed her gray cardigan with a steady hand and lowered herself into the back row. The folding chair let out a soft creak beneath her, but she didn't flinch. The room was already brimming with the low murmur of anticipation, the rustle of papers, the faint clatter of laptops. She opened her own notebook, a worn, spiral-bound thing, and uncapped a blue pen that had chewed markings near the top. Her fingers tightened slightly around it. At the front of the lecture hall, the podium light blinked on. Professor Joaquin stepped into it like a man used to applause. He wore a pressed charcoal suit and a red silk tie, both too crisp for the muggy Texas morning. His voice, when it came, was measured and exacting like everything else about him. "Today," he said, scanning the room, "we revisit the Riemann hypothesis. I don't expect a full understanding in one session, but I do expect attention." His eyes passed over the rows like a cold beam and snagged briefly on her. No words, no gesture, just a flicker of something sour in the corner of his mouth before he moved on. Saoirse tilted her chin down and wrote the date in the corner of her page. She hadn't come to be seen. A dull overhead hum filled the gaps between his sentences as he moved through the first few slides. His laser pointer danced across the projection, breaking dense equations into digestible fragments for his students. Graduate students in pressed shirts and wide eyes, some furiously typing, others nodding too quickly. Saoirse scribbled, listening for the rhythm in his words, the logic. She wasn't here to debate. She was here to understand. 3 years ago, she'd waxed the floor under that podium. She'd buffed the scuff marks off the baseboard behind where Professor Joaquin stood now. Back then, her only concern had been the budget vacuum filters and whether she could leave early enough to catch Lily's choir recital. But things change. Some slowly, some all at once. A metallic snap came from 2 rows ahead. A student leaned toward her companion, holding a thermos like a trophy. "Think she's auditing?" he asked, not bothering to whisper. The other snorted. "Nah, she probably thinks it's a TED Talk." They both laughed, quiet, cruel. Saoirse didn't lift her head, but she did pause her pen. Her hand curled tighter, the ballpoint now, an anchor. The man at the podium spoke again, outlining a breakdown of multivariable recursion in real-time applications. She leaned forward slightly. Her mind, though battered from long nights and harder days, sparked awake. Numbers had always whispered to her. At 12, she could see patterns in grocery receipts. By 16, she solved calculus from library books. But then Lily came, and with her came the weight of rent, the pull of shift work, the silence of sacrificed dreams. Now in this room full of credentials and expectation, she felt the familiar tug. An equation flickered on the screen. Dense, recursive, nearly cruel in its abstraction. But something in it clicked. A misstep, a tiny fracture in symmetry. She blinked and looked down, not trusting herself. The break ended 20 minutes later, and the hall began to hum with movement. Students stretched, chatted, sipped coffee. Saoirse stayed seated. 2 girls passed by her row. One glanced at her shoes, worn black sneakers polished to near reflection. "Still taking notes?" the girl asked, then leaned in with a half smile. "Gotta love lifelong learning." Saoirse closed her notebook slowly. Her fingers brushed the small blue cloth bookmark tucked at the edge. Lily's last school project, a scrap of fabric embroidered with the word potential. She carried it everywhere now. She rose without a word, heading to the water fountain by the side door. The hallway was cooler, quieter. Behind her, the murmurs of the returning audience echoed like a tide. On her way back, in Professor Joaquin's voice rose again. "If there are no questions, we'll move to the next segment." Saoirse stood just inside the doorway. notebook hugged tight to her chest as Professor Joaquin's words rolled like gravel across the lecture hall. He turned to the chalkboard with performative ease, lifting a piece of white chalk between fingers that never touched dirt or dishwater. The board had been wiped clean, an empty stage for what came next. He wrote deliberately, curves, slashes, loops of logic born from decades in academia. A sprawling equation emerged, complex and layered, the kind that usually ended in published applause. Students leaned forward, some murmuring under breath, others already typing into laptops as if they might catch up. Saoirse didn't sit back down. The numbers moved too fast for her to pretend it was in step 4, an inversion subtle, elegant, but unstable. Her breath caught mid-inhale as she saw the flaw tucked like a frayed thread in a fine coat. She blinked twice, hoping someone else might speak up. No one did. Heads nodded. Fingers typed. Professor Joaquin capped his marker and turned. Any questions before we proceed? Her hand lifted before she meant it to. It wasn't graceful, more instinct than intention. She felt it rise like an echo from her spine. Around her seats shifted. A few heads turned. From the podium, Joaquin followed the movement, his expression freezing when he saw her. Yes, ma'am, he said, and the pause was a needle. You had a question. Saoirse's throat tightened. She felt the sudden weight of the room pressing down, but the math was still clear in her mind, bright and steady, like the way headlights outline a dark road. She started, then took a breath. In step 4, the variable inversion. Wouldn't that introduce inconsistency under the boundary conditions? A silence settled, not the polite kind, the waiting to laugh kind. Professor Joaquin cocked his head, mouth twitching at the edge. I see, he said slowly. And you are? Saoirse Hughes, she replied. A beat passed from which department I work in facilities. Her voice didn't waver this time. The laughter came in trickles, soft, mean, a chuckle in row 3, a snort from the left side. Saoirse felt heat climb her neck. She tightened her grip on the notebook thumb, brushing the edge of the embroidered scrap tucked inside. Joaquin smiled without warmth. Well, me, Hughes from facilities. I do appreciate enthusiasm for mathematics, but this forum is a bit more advanced than what you might find on YouTube. A few louder laughs followed. She could see a student cover his mouth in mock restraint. I didn't mean to, she began. No, Joaquin said, lifting a palm. We welcome engagement. In fact, he turned, lifting the chalk again with theatrical flourish. Why don't you come up and help us understand your concern more clearly? Walk us through your insight. She stood frozen. Her legs remembered how it felt to mop those aisles under fluorescent light, how to blend into corners, but not this, never this. Or, Joaquin added, feel free to return to your seat if that's more comfortable. Something in her moved. Maybe it was pride or anger or the weight of always being underestimated. Her heels clicked once against the floor. Then again and again, she walked past rows of students, some stifling grins, others looking away. Each step sounded louder than it should. At the front, she took the chalk from him. Her fingers felt the texture, cool, powdery, fragile. The board loomed large, its green surface smudged faintly from earlier lectures. Let's keep it simple, Joaquin said loud enough to be heard in the back. Wouldn't want to complicate things. She said nothing. The math sat quietly in her mind, not in textbooks or formal lessons, just years of watching, reading, solving in silence. She drew a line, then another. Her hand moved slowly with care, but not uncertainty. She rewrote the problem. Then, step by step, she broke it down. No theatrics, just precision. The room grew still. Fingers paused on keyboards. The only sound was chalk against slate. She didn't look behind her. Didn't need to. By the time she reached the conclusion, her heart wasn't racing. It was calm, like it had slipped into some old rhythm. She capped the chalk. Joaquin stood stiff, arms crossed, He stepped forward, eyes narrowed as he scanned her work. The silence stretched thin. "That's correct," he said, clipped. "Though, of course, it's a standard approach." In the third row, someone whispered, "Then why didn't he use it?" Saoirse stepped back, wiping her hands on her pants as she handed him the chalk. He didn't meet her eyes. She returned to her seat. The air felt different now, heavy with a shift no one quite knew how to name. Joaquin cleared his throat, smoothed his tie, then turned back to the board with a practiced calm that didn't quite reach his shoulders. "Well then," he said, "let's move on." His hand reached for a fresh stick of chalk, longer, unbroken, and with it, he drew a new set of symbols. This equation sprawled wider than the last, its symbols more abstract, its logic tangled. No one in the room moved now. The board filled slowly, like a trap being laid in plain sight. "Let's see if our guest—" He paused for just a second. "Has any thoughts on this?" The lines on the board weren't from any textbook Saoirse had ever read. They weren't classroom problems. They were the kind of raw, chaotic formulations that belonged in research journals and government labs. Her breath caught in her throat. Even from her seat, she could feel the depth of it, the way the equation didn't settle, didn't want to be solved. She didn't move. The quiet began to stretch again. That same expectant silence, but colder now, sharper. It wasn't just the students waiting for her to stumble. It was Joaquin with his eyes like polished stone, daring her to try. When she didn't stand, he reached for the chalk again. "Perhaps we'll return to— Wait!" Her voice was small but unshaken. She rose slowly, holding her notebook like a shield. Her legs felt less certain than before, but the room had grown too small to retreat. Each step toward the front was heavier than the last, but she didn't stop. Joaquin didn't speak as she took the chalk. He stepped aside, lips pressed tight, watching her as though he were waiting for her to fold. Saoirse stood in front of the board, her eyes trailing the lines he'd written. The symbols felt foreign, pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite name. She recognized fragments, clues tucked inside the complexity. But the whole, it loomed. She stared a little longer, breathing through the tightness behind her ribs. Then quietly, she remembered. The break room, the library computer, a PDF article she'd pulled up over a microwaved bowl of lentils. Something about encrypted matrices and eigenvalue rotations in quantum processing. It hadn't made full sense then, but she'd printed it anyway, folded it inside her notebook. That article had shown something, an approach, a method to reorder complexity into something stable. She touched her fingers to the chalk. The first mark came slow, then another. The murmurs died behind her. She didn't solve it at once. That wasn't how her mind worked. She moved carefully, writing and pausing, erasing and redrawing, building something from instinct and half-remembered research. The silence grew thick as fog. Joaquin leaned against the side wall, now arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Halfway through, the trail broke. Her hand stilled mid-air, a dead end. The room exhaled. Joaquin stepped forward. "There's no shame. I'm not done." Her voice was firmer this time, not defiant. Just sure. She didn't look at him. The board blurred for a moment as doubt tried to wedge itself into the cracks, but she blinked it away, eyes narrowing on a line near the top one that had seemed irrelevant before. She saw it now, a symmetry hidden like a key in plain sight. Her hand moved again faster this time. She shifted variables, changed notation. Instead of wrestling the problem into place, she reshaped it. The board began to transform under her hand. What was once a labyrinth now started to resemble a path, twisting. Yes, but walkable. From the front row, a woman leaned forward, chin perched on one hand, the other holding a tablet idly against her leg. Dr. Marianne Johnson, MIT. She hadn't spoken all afternoon, but now as Saoirse connected the final expression and stepped back, Dr. Johnson stood. "That transformation," she said quietly, half to herself. That's Liu Takahashi. Joaquin's brow tightened. Impossible. That method was just published last month. Dr. Johnson finished. Her eyes didn't leave the board in Quantum Mathematics International. It hasn't been introduced in formal education yet. She turned slowly to face Saoirse. How did you know it? Saoirse didn't answer right away. Her hands were still white with chalk dust. She looked at the board at the equation she'd tamed, then back at the woman now staring at her with something dangerously close to wonder. I didn't know. It had a name, she said softly. I just saw it. Joaquin took a step forward, but whatever protest had formed behind his lips never made it out. His arms dropped to his sides. The silence returned, but this time it held no mockery, just awe. Saoirse looked down at her hands, then at the faint blue scrap peeking from her notebook in the front row. Potential. Yes. It had always been there. Dr. Johnson stepped forward. Her heels clicked gently against the tile floor, the sound modest but deliberate. She didn't approach the board with caution. She studied it with reverence as though staring at a newly discovered relic in a forgotten archive. She collapsed 3 variational steps with a single transformation, the professor murmured. And she did it by eye. Someone snapped a picture. Then another Joaquin hovered near the edge of the board, visibly wrestling with something unseen. His mouth moved once, but no words emerged. Dr. Johnson turned her voice stronger now. This isn't just competent. It's inventive. If this were submitted to the Journal of Quantum Mathematics, they'd expedite publication. That was when the first hands rose, not to mock, but to ask, to know. A young man with thick glasses leaned forward. Excuse me, but how long have you been studying? Saoirse's throat felt dry. She blinked once, then glanced at the front row where her notebook lay open beside her purse. The edge of Lily's blue cloth bookmark fluttered slightly in the air conditioning. She stepped back from the board and folded her hands gently, clasping them in front of her stomach. Her voice, when it came, was steady, quiet, but rooted. I've studied math since I was a girl. Not formally, she said, meeting the boy's eyes, mostly on my own. I'd check out old calculus books from the library, read white papers on borrowed computers, solve problems at night after Lily went to bed. The murmurs returned gentler this time, a shifting tide of understanding. A girl in the second row raised her hand, then dropped it and spoke anyway. Why work here? As a custodian. Saoirse smiled, soft but not apologetic. Because I needed health insurance and flexible hours, she said. Math doesn't pay the electric bill, and theorems don't raise a child. That answer struck like the drop of a pin. Not loud, but sharp. Even Joaquin, rigid as marble, blinked. My daughter's 17. Now, Saoirse continued. Smart. Better with computers than I ever was. I wanted her to have a future I didn't think I could afford for myself, so I cleaned classrooms during the day. Did math problems during my breaks. Solved encryption matrices in the laundromat waiting for a dryer. A hand lowered against a desk with a quiet thump. And for the first time since the seminar began, Professor Joaquin spoke with something unfamiliar in his voice. Not scorn, not superiority, curiosity. You came to this symposium. Why? Saoirse turned toward him, not shrinking this time. Because I couldn't stay away. She said simply, because I love mathematics. And because learning doesn't stop just because your life takes a different turn. A hush settled again, not because of disbelief, but because of something heavier. Recognition. Joaquin nodded once. No rebuttal. No clever dismissal. A pause. Then she turned back to the board, where the last line of her solution still stood clear and unshaken. For a moment, she just looked at it, at her own handwriting, etched into a space where only faculty and fame had stood before. And then she did the unthinkable. She picked up the chalk again. One step forward, a brief glance toward Dr. Johnson, who gave a quiet nod, and Saoirse began to refine the final expression. Her lines more confident now. She compressed a partial derivative, slid a coefficient to the outer edge. The result: cleaner, faster, sharper. Someone near the back let out a gasp. Dr. Johnson's eyes widened. She's optimizing the collapse function. Saoirse stepped back, letting the chalk rest gently on the tray. This time, she didn't smile, but her face softened in a way that said everything. Not pride, not triumph. Just truth. They knew now, they all knew. When she turned to walk back to her seat, a rustle of movement followed. Students rose not all at once, but in that hesitant, uncertain way people do when awe overtakes order. The applause came then, slow and staggered, then growing, folding into itself like a wave breaking over sand. Saoirse sat again, folding her hands over the notebook in her lap. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. All around her, questions flew technical, eager, respectful, but she let them swirl. Her focus dropped to the worn blue cloth at the corner of her page. Potential. This moment wasn't about being noticed. It was about no longer hiding. And for the first time in a very long time, Saoirse Hughes didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. The hallway outside the lecture hall smelled faintly of waxed floors and old ambition. Saoirse stepped into the cool evening air, the door clicking shut behind her like a final punctuation. She stood still for a moment, notebook pressed to her chest, the warmth of applause still echoing faintly in her ears. Above, the sky stretched wide and unhurried, painted with the soft bruising of dusk. A single star blinked into view. She tilted her chin upward. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to wonder not about solving another problem or surviving another shift, but about what came next. A different life flickered at the edge of possibility, fragile and uncertain. But there. The door opened behind her again. Soft footsteps catching up. Dr. Johnson's voice came low and even. "You've written all of this down somewhere." Saoirse turned to meet her expression, guarded but honest. "In notebooks. Mostly late at night. After Lily's gone to sleep." Dr. Johnson nodded slowly, as if weighing the answer not just for its content, but its context. "And you've worked with number theory factorization algorithms." Saoirse hesitated. "I've explored some ideas. I wasn't always sure they were right. I just followed where the numbers led." Joaquin's voice broke the pause drier than the night air. He stood a few paces behind Dr. Johnson, arms folded, but without the stiffness of before-prime factorization specifically. She nodded. He blinked, then muttered, "That's the backbone of quantum cryptography, Doctor." Johnson's eyes didn't leave Saoirse. "You realize what this means?" Saoirse glanced down at her fingers. Chalk dust still clung beneath the nails. She wiped them absently against her cardigan. "I realize I never expected to be asked." Dr. Johnson smiled, small but sincere. "We need to talk. Saoirse, there are programs, fellowships for people with extraordinary intuition and original thinking. We could arrange for sponsorship, access to journals, mentorship. You wouldn't need to mop floors to study anymore." Joaquin exhaled, half resignation, half respect. She wouldn't be the first mind academia overlooked. Dr. Johnson glanced at him, but one of the rare ones it has a chance to redeem. The moment was quiet again, but different now, full. The following weeks, blurred in fragments, conversations, phone calls, document scans, and letters with embossed seals. Saoirse carried her notebooks in a canvas tote pages, worn margins filled with coffee stains and looping annotations. She handed them over with a trembling mix of pride and terror. Her world tilted. By winter, the acceptance letter arrived. A special appointment at MIT, non-traditional, accelerated but real. Sponsored her name in black ink, her future outlined in bold. She told Lily first. The girl stared at the envelope, jaw slightly open, a slice of toast forgotten in her hand. "You're going to MIT." Saoirse smiled. "Looks like we both are starting fresh." A year later, the whiteboard squeaked faintly as Saoirse finished drawing a complex proof. The classroom smelled of fresh markers and warm radiator pipes. A group of undergrads leaned forward, pencils poised, eyes squinting. She stepped back, pushed the sleeves of her gray cardigan to her elbows, and turned to face them. "You're not memorizing steps," she said. "You're learning the language of structure. That's what math is. It's how order emerges from noise." A girl in the second row raised her hand, then let it fall. Saoirse caught the hesitation and smiled gently. "Go ahead." The girl looked barely 20. Shy eyes, a pencil with chewed edges. "Did you always know you'd end up here?" Saoirse paused, thoughtful. "No," she said. "But I always knew I couldn't stop learning, even when no one thought it mattered." She didn't tell them about scrubbing baseboards or budgeting for new shoes. Not today. They didn't need the whole story to understand the lesson. Across campus, her name now appeared on published papers, 2, in fact, co-authored with Dr. Johnson. The first had stunned the cryptography community. The second had stirred interest from a federal research group. And Joaquin. He'd taken longer to come around, but he had. In a faculty meeting 3 months prior, he had stood reluctant, measured, and said, her solution advanced the entire discussion on modular theory. There's no denying it. She had nodded her thanks. That was enough. Later that evening, as Saoirse locked her office and stepped into the cool Boston dusk, her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. A message from Lily. "Got it. Full ride. Computer science starts." Fall. Saoirse closed her eyes for a moment, the smile rising before she could stop it. The word potential echoed quietly in her mind, not as a wish, but as a legacy. She looked up at the moon above the rooftops. This door had opened because she'd knocked. The dry erase marker squeaked faintly as Saoirse drew the final line of the proof. Her script neat but unhurried. The students sat quietly, some scribbling notes, others just watching. The late afternoon light spilled through tall windows, casting long bars of gold across the whiteboard and her shoulders. Behind her, someone shifted. A notebook rustled. Then a pause. A small hand went up in the third row, hesitant, trembling slightly in the stillness. Saoirse turned. The young woman, pale-skinned, dark hair tucked behind one ear, didn't lower her hand, though her eyes flickered like someone bracing for correction. Saoirse offered a quiet smile, warm as a shawl draped over chilled shoulders. "Go ahead." The girl hesitated. "I don't know if this is the right question," she said, her voice soft. "But what if you never feel smart enough to ask?" Saoirse set the marker down gently, the sound a mere click against the metal tray. Her fingers brushed across the front of her cardigan, still gray, though new now, softer than the one she used to wear on night shifts. She stepped away from the board, letting the silence fill the space. "Never be afraid to raise your hand," she said, looking directly at the girl. "The question you're afraid to ask might change everything. Not just for you, but for everyone in the room." The girl blinked, nodded once. Her hand lowered, but her gaze stayed steady. It wasn't about the equation anymore. It was about permission. Later, as the last students filed out, Saoirse erased the board slowly, methodically. She liked this part of the day, the quiet that came after learning when thoughts lingered like footprints in fresh snow. She paused before wiping the last equation, reading over the symbols one final time. A subtle variation, she'd added something she hadn't seen in textbooks yet. She smiled faintly. "Tomorrow, maybe." She turned off the projector. The room dimmed, and the noise of the hallway filtered in, shoes squeaking doors, clicking the hum of young minds moving to their next moment. Saoirse gathered her things. She slid her notebook into her bag, last careful as always. The cloth bookmark peeked out from the top, its edges frayed now, but intact. Potential. Still with her. Still guiding her hand. As she reached the door, she glanced back one last time. The rows of chairs, the clean whiteboard, the faint echo of footsteps still fading. It was hard to imagine that once she'd mopped floors like these in silence, listening to other people's lectures from the hallway. She walked into the corridor. Outside, the sky hung low and pale dusk creeping toward night. The wind tugged gently at the edges of her coat. She wrapped it tighter and started toward the main gate. A pair of students passed her deep in conversation about proofs and permutations, neither realizing they were speaking steps away from the woman whose work had changed the very field they now studied. She didn't need them to. At the gate, she stopped. Across the courtyard stood a maintenance cart familiar in its shape, its wheels slightly squeaky. A woman, perhaps 40, was collecting trash from a bin, humming quietly to herself. No one noticed her. But Saoirse did. Their eyes met for a moment, just a flicker. Then Saoirse nodded, small, certain, and kind. And in that unspoken gesture passed something more valuable than recognition. It was remembrance, a shared truth that sometimes the greatest minds don't arrive with credentials or titles, but with persistence and silence, and a spark that refuses to go out. Saoirse turned, walking through the archway into the city dusk, leaving behind not just a classroom, but the shadow she'd once lived inside. Her story wasn't finished, but it had found its sentence. And this was the period at the end. Saoirse's journey is a deeply moving portrayal of resilience, quiet, brilliance, and the human spirit's refusal to be silenced. What makes her story so powerful is not just her extraordinary intelligence, but the way it is revealed slowly, patiently in the face of bias, classism, and invisibility. She doesn't demand recognition. She earns it through persistence, humility, and grace. From mopping lecture hall floors to solving advanced mathematical theories in front of the very people who once dismissed her, Saoirse becomes a symbol of untapped potential and dignity. Her transformation is not flashy. It's rooted in everyday sacrifice, late-night study sessions, parenting as a single mother, working a job that kept her dreams on pause, but never out of reach. The most profound lesson here is that genius is not confined to titles, institutions, or social status. True brilliance can be hidden in the margins of society, waiting only for a moment of courage or an open door. This story is a tribute to every unseen person with a silent gift. It reminds us to look deeper, to listen more carefully, and to never assume that worth comes dressed in credentials. Sometimes greatness sweeps floors before it stands at the front of a room. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.